Okay, we'll start as we usually do with the Apologetian for St. Cosma. Dias pisteos, didascalia catechos misas, in ecclesiam zelotis ton apostolum genomenos, sigatitia capiterumenos evangeliu ton logum diespiras, Cosma endoxe Christum ton theoniceteve, dorisas te imitum Megaleos. All right, for those of you that are new and are just joining us for the first time this week, what we've been doing together over our past month or so together is delivering a series of homilies which I've entitled An Introduction to the Orthodox Faith according to St. Cosma. Now, as all of us probably know very well by now, St. Cosma is a very important saint in our tradition. And what he's perhaps best known for is for touring the whole of Greece during the period of the Turkish occupation. And at each stop he made during his tour, understanding the ignorance of the people to whom he was sent to preach, he would deliver 5 homilies. And these 5 homilies contain what I would say is easily one of the best presentations of the core of the Orthodox faith that we have at hand today. And so on the basis of these 5 homilies that St. Cosma preached, I've tried to pull out most of the central points that he talks about, and I've done up sort of 15 homilies, 16 homilies that try to present these points. And so far together, first we spoke about the fathers and the authority of the fathers within the context of the Orthodox Church. We looked at a few of St. Cosma's points about the Holy Fathers and why we listen to them. The next homily we gave, we talked about God, because as St. Cosma says, we begin all things with discussion of God. And particularly we talked about God as Trinity and how he's been revealed to us through the voice of the Holy Fathers, through the scriptures and the prophets. After that, last week, we moved on to a discussion of creation. And we talked about God's movement outward and that he created this whole world that we enjoy out of pure love and without a sense of obligation. If God needs to create for some other reason, we said God is somehow imperfect if he has a requirement. But God doesn't have any need. We know that because he is perfect, and therefore when he created purely out of love. And so today, we're going to move a little bit deeper into our presentation of creation. And we're going to look specifically at what St. Cosma and what the Holy Fathers say about the creation of man. And then coming through that, we'll end up somewhere around the fall. So we'll begin this week by speaking of the many great blessings and advantages which God bestowed upon mankind at his creation. Such blessings that man might rightly be called the jewel of God's creative work. By the end of today's homily, however, with God's help, we will come down from this very high point and reach the lowest point of human history, the disobedience of our first ancestors, Adam and Eve, with its terrible effect on humanity's path in the world. So we're going to start off by looking at the glory with which man was created, the glorious situation in which, or rather man's glorious manner of existence at the beginning. And we're going to hopefully, by the end of tonight, arrive at the fall, where we describe perhaps the lowest point of human history. Now, if we bring our minds back to last week, we'll remember that God gave the first created man, and through him us, gifts which set him apart from every other created thing. Man is different than every other created thing. Now, what are some of these things that set him apart? Well, first of all, we'll remember that unlike any rock or any plant or any animal, God gave man a body and an immortal soul, which he placed in man at the very moment of his creation. This is something that differs, that causes man to differ from every other element of creation. Man has both a body and an immortal soul. Things like rocks, like plants, don't necessarily have a soul. But animals, we say, do have a soul. This is an important point that we'll spend a second on right now as we're passing through it. Man, I said, has an immortal soul. We'll go on to what that means as we go on in continuation. Animals also have a soul, but their soul isn't immortal. The soul of an animal has a very specific purpose in its existence. It provides life to the body. But when the body of an animal dies, the soul dissipates. It's done its task. Our soul, on the other hand, is immortal. So when our soul separates from our body, it goes to paradise or it goes to Hades, for example. It lives on. The animal soul doesn't, though. And so that's a very, very important distinction. So that's one of the things that sets mankind apart from the animals and from the rest of creation. He has body and immortal soul. And this is why the Orthodox Church has always strictly opposed what is now all too common practice of abortion. We believe that the instant conception has taken place, at the instant of conception, that tiny life has already been endowed with a soul, and thus it is already human in the fullest sense. From the very moment of its conception, it's fully human. It has a soul, an immortal soul, and a body. So what else? What else did God give man that sets him apart? Looking back at the prophet Moses' narration in the book of Genesis, we see that God gave man dominion. He made him a king, so to speak, over the whole created order. And this is shown when God, as we read in Genesis, brought to Adam all the wild beasts of the field and all the birds of the sky, to see what he would call them, and whatever Adam called them, that was his name. By allowing man to name the creatures, God demonstrated that they were somehow subject to man. This same narrative highlights yet another of man's great gifts. It shows man's rationality, his ability to think. For as St. Ephrem the Syrian points out, it's not impossible for a man to discover a few names and keep them in his memory. But it's difficult for him to discover in a single hour thousands of names and not to give the same name twice. So these gifts then, brothers and sisters, to have an immortal soul, to have dominion over the animals, to be rational, along with all the other gifts like free will, that is the ability to choose right from wrong and so on and so forth, these gifts separate man from the animals and make him like unto God. This is what it means when we are told that God made man in his image. Speaking of these gifts that God has given, St. Gregory of Nyssa writes, "Since the list of individual good gifts is a long one, it is out of the question to apprehend it numerically, and thus the language of Scripture therefore expresses it concisely by a comprehensive phrase. In other words, the Bible sums it up in one little line. What is this line? It is to be made in the image of God." So all of these gifts taken together, all these specific gifts that man was endowed with at his creation by his creator, set man apart from the rest of creation and constitute what it means to be made in God's image. But this was not all that God gave to man, however. And God said, we are told in Genesis, "It's not good that man should be alone. Let us make for him a help." And thus God brought a trance upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs, and God formed the rib which he took from Adam into a woman. Woman then, very literally, is God's gift to man. As we turn to the interpretation of this point, I'm compelled to make a reference to modern feminism, which tells women that they have been oppressed by years of evil Christian teaching. When we hear the Holy Father speak about this passage, we realize that absolutely nothing could be further from the truth. They emphasize the fact that when God makes woman in the Genesis account, he doesn't take a fresh lump of earth and start again, but rather what does he do? He takes Adam's own rib and creates Eve. And why do the fathers think this is important? Because it shows us that in all the most important points, all those qualities associated with being in God's image, man and woman are entirely equal. They are entirely equal in their being, entirely equal at their core. If God had made Eve out of something else, we might be tempted to say that she was different. But this is not what happened. God took the rib of Adam and made Eve. Now, seeing that this is the Christian teaching, let's take a minute to look at what the modern philosopher Hegel, one of the quote-unquote great thinkers of our age, says about women. This is what Hegel says, the father of evolutionary science, in essence, because he inspired Darwin. This is what this great enlightened thinker says about women. The difference, he writes, between men and women is like that between animals and plants. The difference between men and women is the difference between animals and plants. Men correspond to animals and women correspond to plants. Here we have it, brothers and sisters, a modern enlightened philosophical view of the woman, where she is thought of as a plant. Imagine, we praise these people as being so enlightened and thoughtful, but when we read what they actually say, the doctrine that they impose on the world is entirely inferior to what the scriptures teach and to what we've received in the life of the church. Our patron, Saint Cosmas, who's an 18th century Orthodox Christian saint, draws out the practical implications of this teaching concerning the radical equality of men and women, harshly reminding husbands. This is what he writes. You, O man, ought not to use your wife like a slave, because she is one of God's creations, just as you yourself are. Just as God was crucified for you, so was he for her. Just as you call him Father, so does she. You share one faith and one baptism. She is no lower than you in God's eyes. Then, tying back again to the history of her creation, he adds, remember, God did not make her out of your feet, meaning, in other words, that she is not made in order to be walked on. So look at those two doctrines in comparison. The doctrine of Hegel, who's one of the most respected and enlightened philosophers of the modern period. He says men are like animals and women are like plants, such is the distance between them. But here, on the other hand, the doctrine of Christ, and the doctrine that the church receives from the scriptures and the fathers, the radical equality of women before God. Very, very important that we remember that. Our faith is not so unenlightened sometimes as we're led to believe. So God created man, giving him great, even unimaginable gifts, gifts which made him like unto himself. Remember, he's created in the image of God. Both man and woman are created in the image of God. Then he created for him a companion. He calls her a helpmate, because this is what husbands and wives are supposed to be. They're supposed to help each other in the spiritual life. And then we are told that God planted a garden eastward in Eden and placed there the man and the woman whom he formed. Here, through the holy prophet Moses, God speaks to us of paradise, brothers and sisters. Oh, writes one Athonite elder, if we only knew what paradise is. The human mind is unable to conceive the magnitude of its beauty. It is a place so beautiful that the eye has never seen such beauty. It is a place which St. Cosmas tells us is all joy and delight, where there is neither hunger, nor thirst, nor sickness, nor sorrow. So deep should our longing be for this place that all of our churches are, at least in ideal, made to face the east in order to remind us to struggle in order to return to this, our ancient fatherland. It is there that all the activities of our life are expected to aim. So strong should our desire for this place be that one lone fear, one lone thought should be enough to guide our entire spiritual life. What, we should ask ourselves, if I am not accounted worthy to participate in all this glorious blessedness at the end of my earthly sojourn? In the Garden of Paradise, life was much different than it is for us today in the fallen world. In addition to the spiritual beauty which surrounded Adam and Eve, they also lived in harmony with the animals. Thus, by St. Ephrem the Syrian, we are told that when the animals passed before Adam at the time of their naming, they came before man as before a shepherd filled with love. They came without fear, neither fearing him nor trembling before each other. Thus Adam and Eve did not hunt. They did not eat meat, and so the animals had no need to fear them. Secondly, we know that Adam and Eve lived in virginity in paradise. For St. John of Damascus, the great synopsizer of the Orthodox dogmatic tradition, writes, "Virginity was implanted in man's nature from above and in the beginning. For man was formed of virgin soil. From Adam alone was Eve created. In paradise, virginity held sway." It is in recognition of these two facts that the canons of the Church teach us that we are, one, to fast from meat, and two, to abstain from marital relations during Lent and during fasting periods. In so doing, what do? We try to recapture a bit of the life lived in paradise in our own lives, at least for a period, at least for a small period. The monastics, however, do this year-round, and this is why there's a clear hierarchy in our church. Though marriage is indeed blessed, monasticism is better, for it comes closest to living the life of paradise, and as we shall see later, it comes closer to the life of Christ himself. Now this all begs the question, what were Adam and Eve to do in paradise? They were assigned the following task: to cultivate and keep the garden. This, according to the Holy Fathers, does not mean what it seems to mean at first glance. For such a divine place, like the Garden of Paradise, had no need of people to till it and keep it up. Instead, what Adam and Eve were charged with doing was cultivating and keeping the garden of their mind. Remember, by mind, we mean here that faculty of the soul which receives grace. They were, in other words, to keep their innocence. They were to obey the one commandment that God had given them. You may eat freely, God says, of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day, the day you eat of it, you shall die. So long as they kept this commandment, willingly their minds would be pure, and they would be full of God's grace, and thus they would, according to St. Seraphim of Sarov, remain immune to the action of every one of the elements. Neither could water drown him, nor fire burn him, nor could the earth swallow him up in its abyss, nor could the air harm him by its actions in any way whatsoever. He would, in other words, have lived eternally in both body and soul, his body sustained by the grace of God. But why did God give them a rule to follow in the first place, one might ask? Isn't this just sort of setting them up for failure? Couldn't God have simply left them in paradise to enjoy whatever beauty and whatever joy were there to be experienced? It is because God wanted more than paradise for them. He wanted to place them in heaven, where their joy would be made full. He would have, in other words, allowed them to eat of the forbidden tree eventually, but, and this is an important but, they had to be spiritually ready for such a feast. Having a rule gave Adam and Eve an opportunity to show their love for God, that they had a desire to grow spiritually through persisting in obedience. Think of it in terms of a child at play, brothers and sisters. If the child is given no rules, it is very difficult to say if he respects his parents or not. And it's difficult for him to develop the habit of respectful behavior. If he is given rules and boundaries, however, then we have a standard to measure his level of respect, and he has a standard against which to test the limit of his own will. Such testing strengthens his will so that it is easier for him to choose the good. There is nothing evil about the tree itself then. God did not create some poison tree in the middle of the garden. Rather, it was the means by which Adam and Eve could train their will. This is also why the tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For either way, by means of it, man would learn good and evil. If they remained in obedience, they would have learned evil externally, theoretically, by virtue of the fact that they had come to know good. If they disobeyed and ate of the tree, then they would know the difference between good and evil by experience. So returning then to the life in paradise. God left Adam and Eve in paradise, giving them every advantage, and he allowed them to eat of every other fruit in the garden. He gave them the whole of paradise and all of its beauty. He gave them countless spiritual gifts, all drawing man towards obedience to the divine commandment. And still, both Adam and Eve fell into disobedience. The devil, who hates all that is good, wanting to draw others into his rebellion against God, came to Eve in the form of a snake, asking, "Did God say you shall not eat of the tree of the garden?" And the woman said unto the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die." And the serpent then said unto the woman, "Ye shall surely not die, for God doth not know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. How much, brothers and sisters, one could say about this passage. We will, however, limit ourselves to a few of St. Cosmas' comments. First, he comments on why the devil chose to try Eve first. He thought, comments the saint, that if he could trick the woman, then by means of the woman, it would become easy to trick the man. Now this, brothers and sisters, is a general truth of the spiritual life of couples. The wife can much more easily dictate the rhythm of a couple's spiritual life. If she fasts, the husband will more easily fast, for example. This then is a great responsibility, for this means that the opposite is also true. St. Cosmas warns, "Be careful, my Christian women, that as far as possible you keep God's commandments and avoid doing the will of the devil. If it should happen that you do fall into a vice as men do not draw your husband into evil with you, as did Eve." Now what is described next is Adam and Eve's encounter with God in the garden. First, we are told that they attempted to hide from their Creator, a foolish act, since, as we have already said in the previous homily, God is everywhere present and sees all things. It's foolishness to attempt to hide from God. When they finally do present themselves to God, however, Adam quickly begins to blame Eve. "The woman who thou gavest me to be with, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." Then Eve takes her turn and quickly puts blame on the serpent. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate," she says. In place of repentance, which might have helped in their case, instead we find first an attempt to hide the sin altogether, and then, having failed, we get to blaming each other. On this point, St. Cosmas observes, "Do you see, brothers, what an awful thing it is to blame others? If we want to be saved, we should always blame ourselves and not throw our own shortcomings on the shoulders of others." This goes for our own thoughts, brothers and sisters, and for our own confessions. It is also worth noting in passing that here St. Cosmas again foils the feminists who say that Christianity fosters a low view of women because it blames the fall on Eve. Listen to what St. Cosmas says when he recounts God's words to Adam's words, rather. Listen to what St. Cosmas says when he recounts God's words in response to Adam's words blaming Eve. He stops him in his tracks and he says, "It is you I told not to eat of the tree. You should have kept the word I gave you, not that of your wife." Who then is responsible in this account, according to St. Cosmas, for the fall? not Eve. Each bears responsibility for their own actions, just like each of us is responsible for his own failings. So we've now, in the past 4 talks, covered 4 fundamental beliefs of the Orthodox faith, and slowly, a little at a time, what these beliefs mean for us. We have learned who we turn to in order to learn about our beliefs, that is to say, to the Holy Fathers. We have learned something about God, particularly that God is Trinity. We have learned about the world he created, and specifically about the gifts that he bestowed upon our forefathers Adam and Eve, and through them upon us. And we have now seen our first parents' rejection of these gifts. Beginning in the next talk, we'll begin to look at the consequences of this rejection of God and what this means for our lives, indeed for the life of the whole of humanity. And then how God himself set about to bring us back to him through the sending of his only begotten Son into the world to suffer and die for us. Amen.
Another question, Father Paul?
That's fine. You're blessed. Look at it.
Bless you.
I have questions. One question is about with the parents and the children, and you said something about how did you say it? Setting the rules and the boundaries with children, and you need to, otherwise the children will just if there's no rules, and they'll just do whatever they want. So my question is more along the lines of, obviously it's important to set rules and boundaries with them. You know, even in society, we have to have order. But at the same time, how do you balance it so it doesn't fall into the other extreme, where the boundaries or the rules are so strict that the person just rebels and just completely rejects what you're saying? You know?
Yeah.
So that's my one question. And okay, and then I'll wait, and then I'll ask you. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's a particular rule for it. I think part of how we do that is especially as parents, we try to get to know the nature and the spirit of our kids. We have to know what they respond to and what they don't respond to. Every kid is different. Every person is different, and so some children will take to certain rules more easily and naturally, and they won't feel oppressed by certain things that we impose on them. Other kids are just more rebellious by nature, and they have a harder time dealing with the rules that are imposed on them. And so in terms of finding the balance, I think the balance really comes back to the issue of spending enough time with our kids to actually know what they're like. That's one of our failings in modern society. Some of it's circumstantial, and some of it's our own issue. We actually don't know our kids that well. We don't spend a lot of time with them. And so it's going to be pretty hard for us to determine where that boundary is for each child when we don't actually know that much about our kids. We really have to make an effort to sort of spend time with them, figure out what their interests are, get to know their character, and then try to figure out, okay, given that, what's the best rule. Beyond that, I mean, there's lots of things the fathers say, particularly about how to do that. St. John Chrysostom is an obvious source because he writes a treatise called On Vainglory and the Raising of Children. And there he'll talk about discipline and that type of stuff, and sort of how to find the mean between that. Even with respect to punishment and things like that, he'll say, you want to keep it sort of somewhere in the middle. He says if you're too strict with punishments, eventually the child will just sort of become indifferent to it because they're just used to sort of living in that environment of threat. On the other hand, if you're too loose, they'll take advantage of it and they won't ever. And so his idea is you have to use it sparingly enough that they're afraid of punishment, but not so punished that they become impervious to it. So there's general guidelines within the patristic tradition about how to approach that stuff, but I think really the core is what I said previously about we really have to get to know our kids and spend a lot of time with them and figure out, okay, how is my kid going to react in these situations?
No, something else.
Father John, I just want to piggyback from Simon's really good question. With respect to children, and not just children, actually, us as well. The notion of nature and nurture.
Yeah.
Right? I remember my mother, who's a very simple Greek woman, said, a person dies. Actually, I want to comment, or even in Greek, we have the word pethani ki psophai, and a person dies, pethani, an animal psophai. Even the words we use are different for the animal, for the person, as a quick side note. But she said to me in Greek, she said, first a person dies, and then their character comes out afterwards. Meaning, and I said, what do you mean by that? I'm confused. So saying that part of our character are bad habits. Those are so hard to change that even you die first and those change, those come out afterwards. How much within the realm of the fathers do we believe, and if we do believe, how do we believe the effect of nature and nurture?
Well, obviously, I think we believe in the reality of nature, that nature does impact us. I was just reading, for example, something today by Saint Ignatiy Bryanchaninov, and he was sort of making that point that there are certain passions that we are in essence born with, and inclinations that we are born with, that we've inherited through the formation we've received. I don't understand exactly how it works, but we do have places in our tradition that speak about even the manner of someone's conception affecting the way they come out. We know that, if parents aren't respecting feast days, things like that, if they're engaging in forms of relations that aren't blessed and aren't acceptable, that can impact or form of weakness, perhaps, in the nature of the child. Now, in God's providence, that weakness the struggle against that weakness can be the salvation of that child in the end. It doesn't condemn them, but that struggle in God's providence may be something that saves them in the end. So parents can't damn their children in that regard by the manner they've been done that way. So that we do believe very firmly that there is the possibility of being born with inclinations and things that can develop into passions quite naturally, because if they're there and untreated, they're going to be indulged and they're going to create issues for a child as he grows up. On the other hand, we also believe in the responsibility of the individual, and that through proper formation and being given proper rules and proper structure as a child, growing into adulthood, that can offset a lot of the that we inherit. And again, that partially goes back to the question of knowing your child too. For example, if your child, some children have a weakness, they want to please others in a bad way. They don't have self-confidence. Some kids, on the other hand, are very self-confident. They don't care what anyone thinks of them. But there are kids who really want to please others. And if we see that in our child, we have to sort of form that in the right direction and provide rules and structure that help to make sure that doesn't lead them down bad directions as they get older. So that's an example of something that they could be born with by nature, in essence. But then the nurture kicks in afterwards in order to sort of help offset that in some regard. So we do believe that nature has there is quote unquote a nature. Things can be inborn in us. That's what I mean by nature. They're not universal to humanity in that sense of nature, but there are things that can be inborn in a person that need to be responded to by their formation afterwards.
Yeah, because Simon raised a good point. As parents, how we the tutelage we have and how far we go with certain things. And you raised a good point that we have to know the child, because oftentimes in today's politically correct, or whatever we want to call it, just very strange times, is that the culpability. You know, on the one hand, the parents will say, "Well, you know, I did everything." Well, obviously, as parents, we make mistakes.
Yeah.
Me the first, especially the first child.
Yeah.
At the same point in time, people will say, "Well, I was just born that way, so oh well," you know, and then not taking responsibility for those bad traits that are inherent within that person to work on. So that's in the way.
Well, that's it. We're not determined by the way we're born. We still have free will. We still have all those things. We still have the ability to sort of, work through the inclinations we have. They're not determinists. They don't determine us.
Thank you, Father. My second question, Father, is about, you mentioned something about, you're talking about Adam and Eve, and you're saying about how Adam, the fathers they said that Adam didn't have to listen to his wife. He could have went back to God. And where St. Cosmas said, well, you were told by God, don't do this, which it kind of brought a thought to my head about this belief in the West, about guilt, about, and I'm not talking about shame. I mean, shame is a different thing. You do something, your conscience pricks you, you feel shame, and then you steps towards repenting, confessing, apologizing to whoever you'd wrong. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about guilt, depression, despondency, where, for example, I'll just say this as for example, my first high school, the majority of the people in my first high school, it was an all black high school. Mm-hmm. I think I was like the only white person there, right? Maybe 2 or 3 other people. And some of them were okay, but some of them had this idea that all white people are responsible for the actions of their ancestors or people that may have done harsh things. You know, you see in South Africa, the way the white race is being treated, like disgusting. They're being treated like garbage. Like I would even call it a genocide, right? And they're saying, oh, or you see other situations where, for example, some women, oh, well, men treated women this way in the past, so you deserve, and my thought is, like you were saying, that everybody's responsible for their own actions. And I know also in the Old Testament, it says something about we bear the sins of our fathers or something like that. So what is the Orthodox understanding of guilt? And if we even do believe in guilt, and at what degree are we responsible? Are we responsible for the actions of other people, and especially someone that I've never met, that I wasn't even alive when they did whatever they did? You know, I wasn't alive in that era. So how am I really responsible for that? You know, like does that make sense? I don't know if it makes sense what I'm saying.
I think I know what you're getting at. In a way, I think it hits on a real problematic aspect, I think, of modern society and where we are right now. In our passions, we've developed a very, very strong inclination towards hatred and basically really what it is when it comes down to it, without getting into particular details, we don't have the spirit of forgiveness that the gospel calls us to. Without speaking about any particular group or particular situation, we're much more a culture now of holding to account versus a culture that looks on the world with the eyes of love and forgiveness for past transgressions. In terms of personal culpability, I don't really think there's any account in the gospel of personal accountability for sins of other individuals. Ultimately, I think the gospel sends a pretty strong message that we're each individually accountable for our actions, even if there's situations that influence or negatively sort of put us in a context that may have led us towards sin, we're still the ones ultimately personally responsible for what we do, individually responsible for what we do. I don't think there's an account of a people being responsible for any particular thing that way. But yeah, right now we tend to be in a cultural situation, I think, where there's a very firm, we have a lot of anger, and we have a very firm desire to hold people accountable. And not that there is a place for personal, I think, accountability for people who do things that are inappropriate. In the right circumstances, the punishment of someone who has done something inappropriate can contribute to their salvation, because it calls them to repentance and all of that type of stuff. It is important for people, individuals especially, to be held accountable for their actions. But what's missing in our age is like I said, I think the spirit of forgiveness is sort of completely gone, and it's more. And part of the problem is with that, we don't have that spirit of forgiveness because we don't see our own sins. Part of the reason that we can come out so aggravated and so aggressive towards everybody that does wrong in this world is that we honestly don't have any sense. We don't have any sense of our own sinfulness and our own passions, and that leads us to be exaggeratedly angry with people who we feel have wronged us. Again, it's not to downplay wrongs. There are lots of societal wrongs that have existed in history.
Sorry, Father, to interject. I mean, the reason I bring this up is because I can't talk about other countries. I can talk about Canada, and I see a certain, how do I say it, culture being promoted now in Canada, where a certain group of people, whether it's politically motivated, attacking Canadians and saying things like, well, your ancestor did this, or, I mean, if it wasn't even their ancestor, it could have even been their neighbor. For example, the tearing down of the first Prime Minister of Canada's statue, claiming that he was racist. And, to me, that was the biggest disrespect that they could have done to Canadians. Or then you see certain things like, oh, white people, white privilege, you don't deserve any rights because of, look at what happened in the past. Like, how is it their fault?
Yeah.
You can't blame every single white person for, like, it's just ridiculous. Like, or my first high school, when the Rodney King thing happened in LA, and, in my first high school, anybody who wasn't black took a beating. And then when they said, well, why are you doing this? Well, now you know how Rodney King felt. Well, how's it my fault about Rodney King? Like, that's kind of where I'm going with this. Like,
I think at the end of the day, in terms of societal movements and things like that, there's a level at which we can hope to influence society. There's also a level at which I think we probably have to recognize that we are on the downward turn of history. Things are not getting better, they're getting worse. Love is growing cold, as we're told. And the real question, I think, for us, more than social reform, and I say this as someone who was once a political science student, the question for us at this stage, more than social reform, I think, is ensuring that we're prepared to bear wrongs and to live in this society as it is. I think really that's sort of where we are, and that's what we really have to be thinking about is, okay, what does Christ call me to in the midst of a society that really is headed in a direction and is firmly committed to a direction that is ultimately going to bring about this kind of despisal of individuals and of peoples. And so rather than sort of saying, responding on a social level and sort of saying, what do we do about it? I think the real question for us is, we have to learn to suffer. We have to learn to sort of, with dignity, Christ teaches us to be able to live being wronged and being blamed and being, mistreated. I have the same reaction. I react really poorly. Like, for example, to the stuff with Johnny McDonald's statues and things like that, and taking his name off schools. I understand he's a flawed individual, and his legacy is maybe mixed because he maybe there are some things that weren't perfect. But nobody whose statues we erected is perfect. We don't celebrate any of these people for the evil they did or for the bad they did. We celebrate them for the contribution they made to our society. And if we're going to start taking down if we're going to start taking down statues of anyone who has a flaw, we're going to have no statues. And this is what I fear sometimes, is that some of the people who are heavily blaming aren't realizing that even the method of their attack betrays such a level of flaw that it's truly frightening in terms of what that means for a person when they're able to get to the stage that they hate that thoroughly. So it's to be, I think we should feel a lot of love. We should also be, for people who have suffered and have been wronged in their past, we should have a lot of sympathy, and we should certainly feel awful for what they've had to go through, and that should sort of arise a feeling of compassion, and that should lead us to tolerate maybe what we might call an overreaction in some cases, in the same way we do with loved ones. When you love someone and they get angry and they lash out, I mean, like I do with my wife sometimes when I'm mad about something or those types of things, she bears my being upset because she loves me, even though she doesn't deserve it. It's not really aimed at her. It's just a general upsetness. I think we have to be that way in these types of situations in life. We have to understand and be sympathetic to the fact that something has caused this person to be this upset. They may not be completely justified in being that upset at me, but if they are, I have to be willing to bear that in love. And the hope is that love will conquer the world, that we will, maybe we'll influence that one person by bearing the brunt of their irrational anger at me. Maybe eventually that will positively influence that person and cause them to think about, okay, look at how this person is reacting. I'm on the attack and this person is basically just standing there.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really our obligation at this stage of the game. Sorry, I sort of went on and weaved in and out. My
question was, I think I kind of went off topic here. I think my question was more about the guilt, and at what point are we really responsible for the guilt?
We're not responsible. We're not.
Yeah.
We're not.
More of it. Anyhow, thank you.
Unless we repeat the behavior, if we're doing the exact same thing and we also do it, then we're responsible.
Yeah.
Heavenly Father, I heard recently that when someone brings loaves for the blessing of the loaves service, each person has to bring 5 because it represents the 5 loaves that Christ blessed. Is that true?
They typically do bring 5. I'm not sure. I don't really have that firm memory of it being done different places in North America, but whenever I was in Greece, it was always 5.
Okay. Thank you.
The only comment that I was going to make, and it's on the other topic, was I try not to be judgmental, and it's kind of hard, and we all struggle with it. So I try to picture myself every time with a log in my eye, like Christ said, don't criticize your brother for the mote in his eye and try to remove it, because I've got a log, and that taught me something.
Yeah.
And that's a simple way to do it, because it's throughout the Bible, because you can live in the new kingdom in today's date if you choose to.
Sure.
And our is teaching that very strongly.
Yeah.
And God bless them for it, because we do have the choice.
Yeah. We absolutely do.
Thank you for clarifying it in such a clear way. Thank you.
I don't know if it was clear, but
Papa, these are beautiful topics, and we see how the saints, in this case Saint Cosmas, they're always contemporary, and these teachings are when we hear them begin to help realign within us, even question ourselves in these various behaviors that we have, because the grace of God should be touching us, that we should be in a spirit of continual repentance. So that's why it's very timely, these things that you're bringing forth for us, and as I mentioned earlier, in the Greek language, it helps to define certain words to show that we are not animals.
yeah,
We are above the animals. So to further with Hegel, and I suffered with Hegel in university, and I was like, okay, I'm not understanding him, so I must be really dumb. And it wasn't until afterwards, no, there's a problem over there. In the choice of Greek words, like even when we refer to animals, the traditional Greek word for animal is alogo,
yeah,
which we use today towards horse, but alogo meaning the one without a word,
yeah,
can't
yeah.
speak. And so it's good to go back to these etymology of these words because it gives the proper Orthodox mindset on how we view plants, animals, and human beings.
Well, that's it. It's especially important, I think, now in the modern period on a practical level. One of the issues that we're seeing is a real confusion between what is an animal and what is a person. I mean, people are now at the phase where we're treating animals like people. And in order to prevent that passion, and it is a passion because we are disrespecting the order God has created, and often we're wronging men for the sake of animals, which is not correct. It's important for us to know these basic things about our dogmatic teaching, because that helps us to order our lives properly. If we understand that an animal, at the end of the day, though it has a soul, when the animal dies in the soul and body, the soul is gone. It doesn't have an eternal existence like we do. That demands that we treat humans with a dignity that's not the same as the dignity we treat animals with. We respect animals, we can love them, we should not mistreat them, but we have to understand they're not of the same order of creation. And that gets confused sometimes, especially now, even with the death of animals. I mean, forgive me for even saying it, but I've heard of priests that have been asked to do trisagia and things for animals. People don't, because we don't understand the dogmatic teaching of the church, which is based in the experience of the fathers, we end up doing this kind of stuff. And it's not good for us at the end of the day. It cultivates a spirit in us that, for example, wrongs our fellow man very easily because we're so focused on our animal buddies. We've got to be careful with that stuff. And so that's why it's very important to go back through this stuff and to hear St. Cosmas on the dogmatic points, because as he pointed out to us in the very first talk, these dogmas are all tied directly to moral points. I mean, remember when we talked about God's being everywhere present, and St. Cosmas immediately turns around and says, well, how does that impact the way I live? It means I should be conscious that in every action I undertake, God is watching me. What happens here tonight? I mean, there's a number of very good points tonight, but particularly there's some strong points with respect to confession. What happens when God approaches Adam after he sinned? First he hides, and then he blames. Well, those are two huge pitfalls for us in the spiritual life in terms of how we respond to our sin. The first pitfall is to avoid confession altogether and hide out. The second pitfall is to come to confession and blame. Hear confessions. I mean, as priests hear confessions sometimes, and we probably do it ourselves if we think honestly. We go to confession, and we haven't confessed a sin by the end of confession because we spent the whole time giving excuses, blaming why this happened. So that's also a valuable moral point tied to the dogmatic teaching of the church about Adam and Eve and what happened in the garden. So it's all very valuable. We have to take a bit of time to think about it. And sometimes it's a bit hard. The content is hard, but we really do have to think about these things. There's reasons the Father's present. There's a reason Saint Cosmas, who goes and speaks to the people on these very simple topics, there's a reason he insists on teaching them dogmatic things that normally we would say our temptation would be in this age to say, oh, why would you bother? Why would you bother talking about the Trinity? Why would you bother trying to understand that in the way the Fathers have presented it? Why would you bother going through the fall and all of its details? Saint Cosmas thinks it's important because it influences the way we think about our life and the way we act.
Would you call it spiritual anthropology?
Yeah, spiritual anthropology is the makeup of man. This whole topic today, in a way, was a first toe dip into spiritual anthropology. We get to see what was man in his creation. He's a creature endowed with gifts which distinguish him from all of the rest of the created order. You know, we start to see who human. He lives in a place, this beautiful place called paradise, and we're going to see how that whole situation is altered next time by the fall.
I mean, Papa, thank you so much again for sharing this with us, and God willing, in the next series of talks, we'll continue in this vein. It's very therapeutic, which is at the end of the game, that's the role of the church, is to heal us. So the saints of these doctors are giving us this various medicine. So thank you for sharing it with us. If we could ask for your closing prayers.
Christ, the true light which illumines and sanctifies every man who comes into the world, let the light of thy countenance be signed upon us, that in it we may behold the light unapproachable. Guide our footsteps aright to the keeping of thy commandments, through the intercessions of thine all immaculate Mother, of the holy, glorious, and all laudable Apostle Luke the Evangelist, and of all the saints. Amen.
I mean.